Alchemy by Titus Burckhardt. Chapter 3. The Hermetic Wisdom. The perspective of Hermetism proceeds from the view that the universe, or macrocosm, and man, or the microcosm, correspond to one another as reflections. Whatever there is in the one must also in some manner be present in the other. This correspondence may best be understood by reducing it to the mutual relationship of subject and object, of knower and known. The world, as object, appears in the mirror of the human subject. Though these two poles may be distinguished theoretically, they nevertheless cannot be separated. Each one can only be conceived in relation to the other. For the sake of clarity, it is necessary to examine here the various meanings that may be given to the term subject. If one says that man's view of the universe is subjective, this usually means that the view in question depends on man's particular position in space and time, and on his more or less developed ability and knowledge. Subjective dependence is here that of the individual, or of a temporally and spatially limited group of people. Human understanding, however, is not merely limited from case to case. It is specifically limited in itself, and in this sense there is no such thing as a purely objective knowledge of the world standing outside the sphere of the human subject. Neither the agreement of all possible individual observations, nor the use of means which extend the reach of the senses can get beyond the sphere, which conditions both the world as a knowable object and man as a knowing being. The logical coherence of the world, that which makes its manifold appearances a more or less graspable whole, belongs just as much to the world as to the unitary nature of the human subject. Nevertheless, in every knowledge, however much of it may be colored by the individual or the species, there is something unconditional. Otherwise, there would be no bridge from subject to object, from I to thou, no truth, and no unity behind the countless worlds as seen by so many and so widely varying individuals. This unconditioned and immutable element, which is the source of the more or less hidden truth content in every piece of knowledge, and without which it would not be knowledge at all, is the pure spirit, or intellect, which as knower and known is absolutely and indivisibly present in every being. Of all beings in this world, man is the most perfect reflection of the universal, and, as regards its origin, divine intellect, and in this respect he can be regarded as the mirror or total image of the cosmos. Let us pause for a moment in order to consider the different realities which stand facing one another like mirrors. First and foremost, there is the universal intellect, or transcendental subject, whose object is not only the outward physical world, but also the inner world of the soul, as well as the reason. For the operations of the reason can be the object of knowledge, whereas the universal intellect is incapable of any objectivization whatsoever. It is true that the intellect has direct and immediate knowledge of itself, but this knowledge lies beyond the world of distinctions, so that, from the point of view of distinctive perception, divided as it is into object and subject, it seems non-existent. Rather different is the human subject, endowed as it is with the faculties of thought, imagination, and memory, and dependent on sensory perception, for the human subject has, as object, the whole corporeal world. It is from the universal intellect that the human subject derives its capacity for knowing. Finally, there is man himself, composed of spirit, or intellect, soul, and body, who is both part of the cosmos, which is the object of his knowledge, and who also, in virtue of his special rank, that is, his preeminently spiritual nature, appears as a small cosmos within the larger one, of which he is the counterpart, like a reflected image. Thus, the traditional doctrine of the reciprocal correspondence of the cosmos and the human being is also founded on the idea of the unique and transcendent intellect, whose relationship to what is commonly called intellect, namely reason alone, is like that of a source of light to its reflection in a restricted medium. Footnote: reason may be compared to a convex lens, which directs the light of the intellect or spirit in a particular direction and on a limited field. This idea, which is a link between cosmology, the science of the cosmos, and pure metaphysics, is by no means the special prerogative of Hermetism, although it is expounded with particular clarity in the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes. Footnote: by metaphysics is meant the doctrine of the uncreated. The greater part of Aristotle's metaphysics is no more than cosmology. A characteristic of true metaphysics is its apophatic character. In one of these writings it is said of the intellect or spirit, the intellect, nous, derives from the substance, ousia, of God, insofar as one may speak of God having a substance. Footnote: ousia has been translated by substance in accordance with scholastic usage. In reality, it is a question here of the essence of God. Of what nature this substance is, God alone can know exactly. Footnote: that is, the substance, or rather essence, of God cannot be known by anything outside itself, because it is beyond all duality and all distinction between object and subject. The intellect is not a part of the substance of God, but radiates from the latter as light shines forth from the sun. In human beings, this intellect is God. One must not let oneself be misled by the inevitable defectiveness of the simile here employed. When one speaks of the radiation, or shining forth of the intellect from its divine source, one does not mean some sort of material emanation. In the same book, it is said that the soul, psyche, is present in the body in the same manner as the intellect, nous, is present in the soul, and as the divine word, logos, is present in the intellect. It can also be said, the other way round, that the body is in the soul, as the soul is in the spirit or intellect, and the spirit in the word. God is called the Father of all. It will be seen how close this doctrine is to that of Johannine theology, a fact which explains how Christian circles in the Middle Ages were able to see in the writings of the Corpus Hermeticum, as in those of Plato, the pre-Christian seeds of the Logos. Footnote: St. Albert the Great, amongst others, looked on the Hermetic writings in this way. Although the doctrine of the transcendent unity of the intellect is affirmed by all revealed scriptures, it nevertheless remains esoteric in that it cannot be transmitted to everyone without the risk of a misleading simplification. The chief danger is that, in its effort to comprehend, the imagination may conceive of the unity of the spirit or intellect as a sort of material unity. This would lead to the obscuring of the distinction between God and creation, as well as of the essential uniqueness of each individual creature. The universal intellect is not one numerically, but one in its indivisibility. In this way, it is wholly present in each creature, and from it, each creature derives its uniqueness. For there is nothing which possesses more unity, wholeness, and perfection than that through which it is known. An example of a false view concerning the one intellect present in all beings is provided by the philosophical opinion that, when the individual spiritual being leaves the body at the time of death, it immediately returns to the universal intellect, so that there is no separate survival after death. However, that which, in this life, confers an egoic limitation on the infinite light of the intellect is not the body, but the soul. Now, the soul survives after separation from the body, even when, in this life, it was entirely orientated towards the body, and indeed appeared to have no other content than this. Footnote: this is the reason for the agonies suffered by souls that have been wholly orientated towards the body when they leave the body. Since the intellect, as the cognitive pole of universal existence, is not accessible to discursive knowledge, knowledge of it will not change the experience of the world, at least not in the realm of facts. Essential knowledge does, however, determine the inward assimilation of this experience, i.e., the grasping of its truth. For modern science, truths, or general laws, without which mere experience would be no more than shifting sand, are only simplifying descriptions of appearances, useful but always provisional abstractions. For traditional science, on the other hand, truth is the expression or congelation in a form accessible to the reason of a possibility contained in the universal intellect. And since this possibility is permanently and immutably contained in the intellect, it must also manifest itself in the outward world. The idea of truth is thus much more absolute in traditional than in modern science, without nevertheless the conceptual forms of truth ever becoming an end in themselves, since the reason's and the imagination's grasp of truth is no more than a symbol of the possibilities contained in the eternal intellect. According to the modern point of view, science is built up exclusively on the basis of experience. From the traditional point of view, experience is nothing without that core of truth which comes from the intellect, and around which individual experiences can crystallize. Thus, Hermetic science is based on certain traditional symbols which derive from a spiritual revelation. The expression revelation is used here in a somewhat wider sense than that usually given to it by theology, but is not intended in a purely poetic sense. In Hindu terms, the spiritual process in question would be regarded as a revelation of second rank, that is to say, as Simriti rather than Shruti. In Christian terms, one would speak of an inspiration of the Holy Spirit, intended not for the whole community of the faithful, but only for certain people capable of a particular mode and degree of contemplation. It was in this way, at any rate, that Christian alchemists regarded the heritage of Hermetism. Hermetism is in fact a branch of the primordial revelation, which, having persisted throughout all ages, extends also into the Christian and Islamic worlds. The immutable possibilities contained in the intellect cannot be grasped immediately by the reason. Plato called these possibilities ideas, or archetypes, and one would do well to preserve the true meaning of these expressions and not apply them to mere generalizations, which at best are no more than reflections of true ideas, nor to the purely psychological realm known as the collective unconscious. The latter misuse is especially misleading, since it involves a confusion of the indivisibility of the intellect with the impenetrability of the passive and darksome depths of the soul. The archetypes are to be found not below, but above the level of reason. And so it is that whatever the reason can discern regarding them is never more than a severely restricted aspect of what they really are in themselves. Only in the oneing of the soul with the spirit, or its return into the undivided unity of the spirit, does a certain reflection of the eternal possibilities in the formal consciousness take place. The contents of the intellect, which is, as it were, the faculty of the spirit, thus suddenly congeal in the form of symbols, in the reason and the imagination. In the book of the Corpus Hermeticum known as Poimandres, it is described how the universal intellect revealed itself to Hermes, Thoth. With these words, he looked me long in the face, so that I trembled before his gaze. Then, as he raised his head again, I saw how in my own spirit, nous, the light which consists of a numberless number of possibilities became an infinite all, while the fire, surrounded and so contained by an almighty power, had attained its immobile position. Such is what I was able to grasp rationally of this vision. While I was so completely out of myself, he spoke again. Thou hast now in the intellect, nous, seen the prototype, the origin, and the never-ending beginning. A symbol is whatever, on the planes of the soul and the body, reproduces spiritual prototypes. In connection with this reflection of higher realities on lower planes, the imagination possesses a certain advantage over abstract thought. In the first place, it is capable of multiple interpretation. Furthermore, it is not so schematic as abstract thought, and also, insofar as it condenses itself into a pure image, it relies on the inverse correspondence that exists between the corporeal and spiritual realms, according to the law that whatever is below resembles that which is above. As the Emerald Tablet puts it, Insofar as the human intellect, as a result of a more or less complete union with the universal intellect, turns away from the multiplicity of things and, so to say, ascends towards undivided unity, so the knowledge of nature which a man obtains from such an insight cannot be of a purely rational or discursive kind. For him the world has now become as if transparent. In its appearances he sees the reflection of eternal prototypes. And even when this insight is not immediately present, the symbols which spring from it nevertheless arouse the memory or recollection of these prototypes. Such is the Hermetic view of nature. What is decisive for such a view is not the measurable and innumerable nature of things, conditioned as it is by temporal causes and circumstances. Rather, it is their essential qualities, which one can imagine as the vertical threads, warp, of a woven material, taken as representing the world, round which the shuttle alternately winds the horizontal thread, woof, thus making the woven material a unitary and compact material. The vertical threads are the immutable contents or essences of things, while the horizontal threads represent their substantial nature, dominated by time, space, and similar conditions. Footnote: on the symbolism of woven material, see René Guénon, The Symbolism of the Cross, Chapter 14. From this comparison, one can see how a vision of the cosmos based on spiritual tradition in a vertical sense can be right, even although it may appear inexact in a horizontal sense, that is to say, in the sense of discursive and analytical observation. Thus, for example, it is not necessary to know every existing metal in order to know directly the prototype of metal in itself. It is enough to take into consideration the 7 metals mentioned by tradition: gold, silver, copper, tin, iron, lead, and quicksilver, in order to understand the possible range of variation within the one type. We are only concerned here with the qualitative aspect of metal. It is the same as regards the knowledge of the 4 elements, which in alchemy play such a major role. Footnote: the Hindus speak of 5 elements because they regard ether, akasha, the quinta essentia of the alchemists, as being also one of the elements. These elements are not the chemical constituents of things, but are the qualitative determinants of matter as such, so that instead of speaking of earth, water, air, and fire, one can also speak of matter's solid, liquid, aerial, or igneous mode of existence. The analytical evidence that water consists of 2 parts of hydrogen and 1 part of oxygen tells us absolutely nothing about the essence of the element water. On the contrary, this fact, which can only be known circumstantially and, so to say, abstractly, actually obscures the essential quality water. Furthermore, the scientific approach strictly limits the reality in question to one given plane, whereas the immediate and symbolical intuition of the element awakens an echo which resounds through all levels of consciousness, from the corporeal to the spiritual. Modern science dissects things with a view to possessing and mastering them on their own level. Its aim is, above all, technology. Rationalism clung to the belief that by means of material and quantitative analysis, it could discover the true nature of things. Characteristic of this point of view is Descartes' opinion that the scholastic definition of man as an animal endowed with reason tells us nothing about man unless, by the study of his bones, tendons, tissues, etc., we know what the word man really means. As if a definition were not all the nearer to the essential, the broader it is. Analytical understanding is ultimately nothing more than the knife which probes into the joints of things. By so doing, it permits a clearer view of these. But the essence is not accessible to mere dissection. Goethe understood this very well when he said that what nature did not reveal to us in the light of day could not be forced out of her by levers and screws. The difference between traditional cosmology, such as Hermetic cosmology, and analytical science, dominated by reason alone, shows itself most clearly in their astronomical outlook. The oldest world picture, in which the earth is seen as a disk covered by the starry vault of heaven, is fraught with the most general and profound meanings. Meanings which are all the less obsolete in that this world picture remains true, being none other than the natural and immediate experience of all mankind. Heaven, by its movement, the measurer of time, the determiner of day and night and the seasons, the cause of the rising and the setting of the luminaries, the dispenser of rain, manifests the active and masculine pole of existence. The earth, on the other hand, which under the influence of heaven becomes pregnant, brings forth plants and nourishes all living creatures, corresponds to the passive and feminine pole. This relationship of heaven and earth, of active and passive existence, is the prototype and exemplar of numerous analogous dualities, such as the conceptual pair, essential form, eidos, forma, and stuff or substance, huli, materia, and the duality understood in the Platonic sense of spirit or intellect, nous, and soul, psyche. The circular movement of the heavens implies the existence of a motionless and invisible axis, corresponding to the intellect, which is immutably present in all circumstances of the world. Likewise, the course of the sun traces a regular cross composed of the cardinal points, north and south, east and west, following which the cosmic qualities which govern all life distribute themselves respectively as cold and warm, dry and humid. We shall see later how this order is repeated within the microcosm of the human soul. The sun's course, insofar as it appears above the horizon, follows an increasingly wide circle from the winter solstice to the summer solstice, and then an increasingly narrow circle until the full year comes round. Basically, this corresponds to an unwinding spiral which, after so many turns, becomes a winding up spiral, an image which has been portrayed in a variety of signs, such as the double spiral, the twofold spiral vortex, familiar as the Chinese yin-yang, and not least in the staff of Hermes, the caduceus, in which two snakes are entwined on an axis, the world axis. Footnote. In this connection, see René Guénon, The Symbolism of the Cross, Chapter 25, and Julius Schwabe, Archetyp und Tierkreis. The opposition made manifest in the two phases of the sun's course, the ascending and the descending, corresponds in a certain sense to the opposition between heaven and earth, with this difference that here both sides are mobile, so that instead of an opposition of causes, it is a question of an alternation of forces. Heaven and earth are above and below. The two solstices are south and north. They are related to one another as are expansion and contraction. We shall again come across this opposition, which has many meanings, in connection with the alchemical magisterium, where it appears as the opposition between sulfur and mercury. Diagram. An Irish or Anglo-Saxon form of the two dragons on the world tree. The swastika on the trunk of the tree, which corresponds to the world axis, represents the movement of the heavens. Each dragon is composed of 12 suns, or stars, which could correspond to the 12 months. From an 8th century miniature from the Pauline letters from Northumberland in Würzburg University Library. The Ptolemaic world picture, in which the Earth as a globe represents the center, around which the planets revolve in a variety of orbits or spheres, surrounded by the heaven of fixed stars, and at the outside by the empyrean, devoid of all stars, does not take away the meaning of the earlier world picture any more than it takes away mankind's immediate experience of it. It brings, moreover, into play a different symbolism, namely that of the all-comprehending character of space. The gradation of heavenly spheres reflects the ontological order of the world, according to which each degree of existence proceeds from a higher one, in such a way that the higher degree contains the lower one, just as a cause contains its effect. Thus, the wider the heavenly sphere in which a star moves, the purer, the less conditioned, and the nearer to the divine origin is the degree of existence, or the level of consciousness which corresponds to it. the starless empyrean, which surrounds the starry heavens and which seems to impart to the firmament of fixed stars, the fastest and most regularly revolving of all the spheres, its movement, represents the prime mover, primum mobile, and so also the all-embracing divine intellect. This was the interpretation of the Ptolemaic world picture adopted by Dante. Before his time, it was already to be found in Arab writings. There is also an anonymous Hermetical manuscript of the 12th century, written in Latin, and probably of Catalan origin, in which the spiritual meaning of the heavenly spheres successively surrounding one another is presented in a manner reminiscent of the Divine Comedy. The ascent through the spheres is described as an ascent through a hierarchy of spiritual or intellectual degrees, by means of which the soul, which successively realizes these, gradually turns from a discursive knowledge bound to forms to an undifferentiated and immediate vision in which subject and object, knower and known, are one. This description is illustrated by drawings which show the heavenly spheres as concentric circles, through which men ascend, as if on Jacob's ladder, to the highest sphere, the empyrean on which Christ sits enthroned. The heavenly circles are complemented in a downward direction, that is, towards the earth, by the elements. Next to the lunar sphere is the circle of fire. Under this is the circle of air, which encloses water, which immediately surrounds the earth. It is noteworthy that this anonymous manuscript, the Hermetic character of which is evident, recognizes the validity of all three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This clearly demonstrates how the Hermetic science, thanks to its purely cosmological symbolic language based on nature, can be combined with every genuine religion without conflict with the respective dogmas. As the revolution of the eighth heaven, the firmament of fixed stars is the basic measure of time. So the outermost starless heaven, which imparts to the eighth its slightly behindhand movement, delayed by the so-called precession of the equinoxes, must represent the borderline between time and eternity, or between all the more or less conditioned modes of duration and the eternal now. Footnote: according to Averroes, the unbroken movement of the starless heaven is the mediator between time and eternity. The soul, which is represented as ascending through the spheres, will thus, once it reaches the empyrean, leave behind the world of multiplicity and of mutually exclusive forms and conditions, and reach undivided, but all-embracing being. Dante represents this crossing, which involves a complete reversal of viewpoint, by confronting the cosmic order of concentric spheres, which widen successively from earthly limitation to divine infinity, with a reversed order whose center is God, around whom the choirs of angels revolve in ever-widening circles. They revolve fastest where they are nearest the divine origin, in contradistinction from the cosmic spheres, whose apparent movement grows in proportion to their distance from the earthly center. With this upturning of the cosmic order into the divine order, Dante anticipated the deeper meaning of the heliocentric worldview. Plates 1 and 2. The ascent of the soul through the spheres. Two analogous representations from an anonymous Hermetic manuscript of the end of the 12th century. Folio 90 shows, at the top, the enthroned Christ above the spheres. Alongside are the words, Creator omnium Deus, causa prima, voluntas divina, the creator of all things, God, the first cause, the divine will, the divine will. The two uppermost circles contain the words forma in potentia and materia in potentia. These are the two poles forma and materia prima, pure act and passive receptacle, which are here conceived as possibilities contained in pure being, and not yet manifested. This is why they lie outside the universal spirit, when this is viewed in its manifested or created reality, which is represented by the next circle. Causatum primum esse creatum primum principium omnium creaturarum continens in se creaturis. First effect, first created being, principle of all creatures, containing all creatures within itself. As stages within the universal spirit, there follow 10 intellectual or cognitive faculties, intelligentiae, to which correspond a similar number of angelic choirs. Curiously, the order in which they appear is the exact opposite to that of the Dionysian doctrine of the heavenly hierarchy. From above downwards they are angeli, archangeli, troni, dominationes, virtutes, principatus, potestates, cherubim, seraphim, and ordo sonorum, choir of elders. This reversal of order may be due to the error of a copyist who had a theocentric scheme in mind. Beneath these 10 spheres of the supraformal spirit lie 4 spheres of the soul: anima celestis, anima rationabilis, anima animalis, and anima vegetabilis. So far, the concentric order of the spheres is intended purely symbolically, whereas the succeeding and ever smaller spheres of the corporeal world are to be understood both symbolically and spatially. The corporeal world is surrounded by its outermost circle, natura principium corporis, nature as principle of bodies. It contains the astronomic spheres, the outermost of which corresponds to the daily revolution of the heavens, spera decima, spera suprema, qua fit motus de occidente ad orientem, and est principium motus. 10th sphere, highest sphere, in which takes place the movement from west to east, and which is the principle of all movement. Inside this is the sphere which determines the precession of the equinoxes. Spera nona, spera motus octave, spera qua fit motus, euste septentrione ad meridiem et a converso. 9th sphere, which moves the 8th sphere and causes it to travel from north to south, and vice versa. Then follow in descending order the heavens of fixed stars and the planetary spheres: spera octava, spera stellata, Saturnus, spera Saturni, Jupiter, spera Jovis, Mars, spera Martis, Sol, spera Solis, Venus, spera Veneris, Mercurius, spera Mercurii, Luna, spera Lunae. Inside these lie the 4 elements in concentric circles around the center of the earth. The outermost circle corresponds both to the domain of the elements as such and to the highest element, fire. Ignis, corpus corruptibilis, quod est quator elementa. Fire, corruptible body consisting of the 4 elements: air, aqua, terra, centrum mundi. Through these circles of the spiritual, psychic, and corporeal worlds, men rise to God as if on a ladder. The lowest figure is still bound to the domain of the elements, and a companion is dragging him up from this by the hair. Alongside the uppermost group is written, O mi magister, O my master. Alongside the next, Ephebi, youths. Alongside the middle group, Socii omnes, all companions. And alongside the lowest, Cetera turba, the remaining crowd. This is presumably a reference to different degrees of wisdom or initiation. The other miniature, on folio 89, repeats the same order, this time with complete circles but with only partial inscriptions. The world picture in which the sun represents the center, around which all planets, including the Earth, revolve, is not an original discovery of the Renaissance. Copernicus merely revived and supported with observations an idea which was already known to antiquity. Footnote: the heliocentric system was already taught by Aristarchus of Samos, circa 320 to 250 BC. Nicholas Copernicus, in the preface to his work on the courses of the heavenly bodies addressed to Pope Paul III, refers to Hecatus of Syracuse and to certain indications by Plutarch. In his book on the heavens, Aristotle writes, whereas most learned men believe that the earth is the center of the world, the Italic philosophers, the so-called Pythagoreans, are of the opposite view, for they assert that in the center there is fire. The earth, on the other hand, which is one of the stars, moves in a circle round the center. Probably certain Indian astronomers of antiquity were also familiar with the heliocentric view. As a symbol, the heliocentric worldview is the necessary complement of the geocentric. For the divine origin of the world, that is to say, the one intellect or spirit through whom God produces the world, can just as easily be thought of as the all-embracing, corresponding to limitless space, as it can be thought of as the one radiating center of all manifestation. Precisely because the divine origin is so high above all differentiation, each representation of it has to be complemented by its own inverted counterpart, as if seen in a mirror. The heliocentric worldview, however, was in fact used by rationalism to prove that the traditional geocentric worldview and all the spiritual interpretations connected with it were pure deception. And from this arose the paradox that a philosophy which made of human reason the measure of all reality resulted in an astronomical worldview in which man was to appear more and more like a speck of dust, among other specks of dust, a mere accident without any sort of cosmic precedence, while the medieval perspective, based not on human reason, but on revelation and inspiration, had placed man at the center of the cosmos. This blatant contradiction is nevertheless simple to explain. The rationalistic view forgets completely that everything which it may express concerning the universe remains a content of human consciousness, and that man, precisely because he can look at his physical existence from a higher point of view, as if he were not in fact bound to this earth, clearly demonstrates that he is the cognitive center of the world. Precisely because man is the privileged bearer of the intellect and therefore may know essentially all that is, the traditional perspective places him at the center of the visible world, which position in fact entirely corresponds with immediate sensory experience. In the same view, namely that of traditional cosmology, the heliocentric world picture, in which man is so to say peripheral to the sun, can only have an esoteric meaning, namely that which Dante has in mind in his theocentric description of the angelic world. From the point of view of God, man is not in the center but on the outermost border of existence. That the heliocentric viewpoint should seem more correct from the physical mathematical point of view is an indication that this point of view itself has something not quite human about it. It refuses to consider man as a whole, as a being composed of spirit, intellect, soul, and body, in favor of an exclusive consideration of the material quantitative plane, and so becomes the inferior reflection of the viewpoint which sees man sub specie aeternitatis. No world picture can ever be absolutely right, for the reality which our observation takes cognizance of is conditioned, dependent, and endlessly multiple. Belief in the heliocentric system as something absolute has created a tremendous vacuum. Man has been robbed of his cosmic dignity, and having been made a meaningless speck of dust amongst all other specks of dust circling round the sun, has shown himself incapable of achieving a spiritually satisfying vision of things. Christian thought, centered on the incarnation of Christ, was ill-prepared for this. To be able to see man as a disappearing nothingness in cosmic space, and at the same time as the cognitive and symbolical center of the latter, quite exceeds the capacity of the majority. Latterly, with the consignment of the sun itself into the stream of countless millions of other suns, perhaps also surrounded by planets, with perhaps thousands and millions of light years between them, no world picture in any true sense of the term is any longer possible. The construction of the world is no longer imaginable, with the result that man loses his capacity to integrate himself into a meaningful whole. Such, at least, is the usual effect of the modern viewpoint on Westerners. The Buddhist way of seeing things, which has always regarded the world as shifting sand, may show a different response to the scientific thesis. If scientific knowledge went hand in hand with a spiritual evaluation of appearances, one would be able to see, in the successive abandonment of all, so to say, closed systems, a proof that every vision of the world is no more than an image or reflection, and as such is in no wise unconditional. For this world, the sun, which our unaided senses experience, is the sum total of light and the natural symbol of that divine origin which illumines all things and around which all things revolve. At the same time, however, it is merely a luminous body, and as such not unique, but one thing amongst others of the same kind. This is not the place to show how each new world picture is demanded, not so much by new scientific observations as by the logical unilateralness of the preceding one. This applies also to the latest conceptions of space. Medieval cosmology imagined the totality of space as an immeasurably great sphere, spiritually encompassed by the outermost heavens. Rationalistic philosophy considered space to be infinite. Since, however, as conditioned extension it may well be indefinite, but is certainly not infinite, the next scientific step leads to a virtually unimaginable concept of a curved space flowing back into itself. The unconditional homogeneity of space and time is abandoned by the latest mathematics in favor of a constant relationship between space and time. If, however, space is that which contains all that is simultaneously observed, and time is that which constitutes the succession of observations, then automatically the fixed stars are no longer separated from us by so many light years, but are situated where visible and simultaneously existing space has its outermost limit. In the face of this paradox, let it merely be said that ultimately every scientific world picture is doomed to contradict itself, whereas the spiritual meaning, which manifests itself in one way or another, in all visible things and which reveals itself all the more convincingly, the more primordial and the more suited to man the world picture is, undergoes no change of any kind. If we speak here of a meaning, we do not mean anything conceptual. We use the expression meaning of necessity and after the example of traditional writings, to designate the immutable content of things which only the intellect is capable of grasping. By means of the preceding observations on the astronomical world picture, we have perhaps succeeded in showing that there are two mutually opposed ways of looking at the world, or nature in the widest sense of this word. The one, impelled by scientific curiosity, strives towards the inexhaustible multiplicity of appearances, and to the extent that it accumulates experiences becomes itself multiple and dismembered. The other strives after the spiritual center, which is at once the center of men and of things, while supporting itself on the symbolical character of appearances, in order to presage and contemplate the realities immutably contained in the divine intellect. The latter point of view leads to simplification, not with regard to what it perceives as a multiple gradation, but with regard to what it deems to be essential. The most perfect vision which man can achieve is simple, in the sense that its inward richness is devoid of differentiated characteristics. This highest vision or contemplation is referred to in a Syriac Hermetical text, from which we should like to quote a few extracts as a conclusion to this chapter on Hermetical wisdom. The text in question speaks of a secret mirror, which is set up behind 7 doors, which correspond to the 7 planetary spheres. The mirror was so made that no man could see himself materially in it, for as soon as he turned away from it, he forgot his own image. The mirror represents the divine intellect. When the soul looks at itself in this, it discovers the shame that is in itself, and casts this away. Thus purified, it imitates the Holy Spirit, and takes him as a model. It becomes spirit itself. It achieves peace, and always returns to this higher state in which one knows God, and is known by him. Then, having become without a shadow, it is liberated from its own chains and from those which it shares with the body. What is the adage of the philosophers? Know thyself. This refers to the intellectual and cognitive mirror. And what is this mirror, if not the divine and original intellect? When a man looks at himself and sees himself in this, he turns away from everything that bears the name of gods or demons, and, by uniting himself with the Holy Spirit, becomes a perfect man. He sees God within himself. This mirror is set up beyond 7 doors, which correspond to the 7 heavens, beyond the sensual world, beyond the 12 heavenly mansions. Beyond all this is this eye of the invisible senses, this eye of the intellect, which is omnipresent and beyond everything. There one sees this perfect spirit in whose power all is contained. Footnote: Berthelot, La chimie au Moyen Âge, Paris, 1893.